Today's date is July the 23rd, 2015. We're at the Chincoteague Island Museum on Chincoteague, Virginia. And today we're interviewing Roy Andrews Jones. And my name is Debbie Bender. Roy, what's your birth date?
My birthday, 6/6/19.
6/6/19. My goodness. Okay. And what were your parents' names?
My dad's name was Morris Jones, and my mom's maiden name was Agnes Andrews.
And did your father, did he also work on the water?
He worked on the water all of his life, and he never learned how to swim.
Really? Your mother stayed at home and raised the children?
Uh-huh.
And how many were there again, siblings that you had?
4.
4.
2 boys and 2 girls.
And their names were?
My older sister was Blanche, and she married Vernon McGee, and my younger sister was Eula, and she married Tommy Dukes. And they had 2 boys. Tommy Dukes always wanted 2 boys, so that's what God gave him. Tommy was over at Tom's Cove with a friend to see if they could sign a mess of clams. Clams weren't showing, if you know what I mean. And they started back to the vehicle. And Tommy told the fellow that was with him, says, "I've got the awfulest cramp in my leg I ever had." And he said he had to sit down. Well, they carried him to the hospital, but he was gone before he even got there.
Now, your brothers, what were their names?
I had one brother, his name was Raymond. And you've heard tell of the Battle of the Bulge?
Oh, yes.
Well, that's where he was killed.
Really?
He didn't come marching home. He came home in a box.
Oh. How old was he?
20.
20. And then your other brother?
I just had one brother.
Oh, just the one brother, okay. And were your parents born on Assateague also?
My dad was born and grew up on Assateague. His dad grew up and lived on Assateague. His dad grew up and lived on Assateague, and that's as far as I can go back. Because my dad was Welch, and my mom was of Indian descent. So I've got a little bit of Indian in me, but I didn't bring my bow and arrow or my tomahawk.
Doggone it. Where did your mother grow up?
My mother grew up on South Main Street.
On Chincoteague.
Yeah.
So your father grew up on Assateague and your mother grew up on Chincoteague.
Uh-huh.
It's amazing they
I
met.
don't know how they ever met. I never did ask them.
Well, can we talk about your childhood? What it was like growing up on Assateague?
Well, growing up on Assateague, I guess I grew up just like any other boy. I had to entertain myself.
How did you do that?
Well, sometimes I'd say, I think I'll make a kite. So I get some little thin sticks, some string, and newspaper, and make a kite. All I had to have was a strip of rags for a tail, and if it was a breeze, just hold it up like that, and the wind would take it right on up.
Now,
And I went up and played on we call them hills. They're just sand dunes, you know. And the sand dunes on the northwest side, they were vulnerable to a northeaster, northwester, or a wester. And the people that lived there, the lighthouse keepers, said, I think it would be a good plan to sod these hills. And we went down close to the channel, and it was an open area, and you could cut this sod. Take a square pointed spade, and you could cut a square out about 8 by 8 and maybe an inch or an inch and a half thick. And it was placed on the hills just like you'd place, not like shingles, but budded just like this. And that kept the hill from eroding. And down to the foot of the hill was where the schoolhouse was. And that, they didn't go by grades like we do, they went by readers. And first reader, second reader, and it went up to the sixth reader, and that was equivalent to an elementary school. And Assateague, well, it boasted of its lighthouse because that's the main attraction on the island. And then down at Tom's Cove, there were 2 fish factories. And these fishing steamers would bring this menhaden in, and they would cook them and get the oil out of them. And they'd put the oil in what we call a 55-gallon drum, you know, just a steel barrel. And the others was cooked and ground up into fish, what we would call it fish meal or fertilizer. So it was nothing wasted. The oil was put in barrels, and then the others were made up into fish meal, or we would call it fertilizer.
Now, what were the houses like?
The houses, if you would go down South Main Street, the houses on Assateague were just like that.
They were 2 stories, that's correct.
There were some single stories.
Okay.
The first house that I ever remember living in was just a 1-story, and that same house is on Ridge Road, right close to Mr. Baldy's. That same little house.
And the steps, did you say at one point that the steps in the house, if it was 2 stories, were on the outside of the house?
No.
They were on the inside?
Yeah, just a stairway.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the masonry constructed house, they had to go up the stairs and open a door and go inside the building. And that's there now just like it was then, no difference.
And how many families, when you were living on Assateague, how many families were there?
20 families.
20 families. Okay. And, okay, this was...
Now, years before that, there were 35 families. And that's the most families that had ever lived on Assateague, was 35 families. But when I was over there, it was just 20. And number 20 house was a man, he never did marry. He lived alone in a little house, and when you go over to Chincoteague, his house would have been right at the foot of the bridge now. He was the last one. And it was a little beach. And that's all eroded away. And when you go down, you can see the tree roots protruding out. But it was a little beach. And I used to go with my grandfather Jones. He called me Johnny. He said, Johnny, I'm going over on the, he termed it, I'm going over on the surf. He meant on the beach. I need so many boards, or I need so many posts. And at that time, the beach was just like a lumber yard. You could pick up any kind of board, any kind of post that you wanted. And one time, times was really tough, and my uncle, Ole Williams, he was over on the beach, and he found this big ham. And he carried it home, and he told Aunt Linda. He took his hand, and he says, cook this much. So they had a good mess of ham.
Did you all put the shells to any use that you would find on the beach? Did they have any use for you or the household?
No, we didn't bother the
With the shells.
shells.
And going back to the school, let me ask you one question about that. When you finished your 6th reader grade, did you go to high school on Chincoteague, or was that the end of school for you?
No, when we finished the 6th reader on Chincoteague, we had to go to Chincoteague.
Oh.
And of course, we had to go across by boat to the east side, and we had to walk to the school.
Where was the school located then?
There on Church Street, School Street runs right alongside of where the school was. And it was the brick building, and behind that was the old wooden building, and that's where I went until I went to high school.
Now, when you were in the school on Chincoteague, were there any special memories that you had about the school or the teacher or the customs that you would have in school? Or
No, there were just benches, you know, end to end, and that's what they said on it.
in one single room?
Huh?
In one single room?
Yeah, one single room.
Getting back to actually the life on Chincoteague, you said that you made your own entertainment.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming there were quite a few children on the island your age to play with. And
No.
No?
There was just one more boy.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Do you remember his name?
His name was Charles Pruitt.
And what was Thanksgiving like on Chincoteague for you?
Well, it was just, at that time, life on Chincoteague and life on Chincoteague was very similar. The only thing, Chincoteague had running water and electricity. And on Chincoteague, we had no electricity, and we got our water. My grandfather Jones had an open well. It was 3 or 4 big pipes, about that big, and one fit inside the other, just like that. And the sand in the bottom of that well was just as white, almost as snow. I don't care how hot it got, the water in that well was always cool.
Well, when you were celebrating, say, Thanksgiving or Christmas, were the celebrations back then as important to you all, or did you celebrate them as much as you would see today as far as the importance?
Every Christmas, my dad would go in the woods and get a cedar tree, maybe 6 feet tall and about like that. just before one Christmas, I was with my mom and we went to Charlie Gall's store and I saw this BB gun hanging from the ceiling by a string. I says, Mom, I'd like to have that. She says, well, maybe you will get it for Christmas. That was all that was said at Christmas morning. Now, I don't know how she ever got that from Charlie Gall's on Chincoteague or the Aztec, but she did. The BB gun and 5 packs of shot came to a total of $1.50.
Oh goodness.
And I mean, I had a big Christmas
Absolutely.
for $1.50.
I guess you did. Now, with those cedar trees that your father would cut down, did you decorate those?
Oh yeah.
How did you decorate them? Did you make your decorations?
No, you could go to the hardware store and get all kinds of different colored, we call them Christmas balls, that hooked on a little limb, and this, what do you call it, this shiny, long, stringy stuff.
Like a garland or tinsel?
Yeah, and that's what we did, that shiny stuff and the pretty balls, and the Christmas tree was decorated beautifully.
Now, I can't remember if it was you that had told me or if it was Miss Blanche, but at one point, I thought I heard that you made ornaments also out of cotton or out of yarn. Is that true?
No. Now sometimes we call them a pine burr. It was really a pine cone, you know. Sometimes we might have 3 or 4 of those under the tree too.
Okay, we were talking about Christmas. What would you all eat for Christmas?
For Christmas, we'd eat the same thing we usually had on Sunday. Now, Sundays, we always had something different than through the week. Sundays, we'd have roast beef, ham, chicken, and dumplings, which that's good eating anywhere. Chicken and dumplings.
Right.
Very few people will refuse chicken and dumplings.
So that was your favorite. Your favorite meal was chicken and dumplings.
Chicken and dumplings.
Mr. Roy, did you ever eat muskrat?
I have never eaten a piece of muskrat in my life, if I knew it. Now, I might have been somewhere and ate it and didn't know it, but I don't believe I could. If I knew it, I don't think I could eat it.
Now, did you have a boat that would bring your groceries over to Assateague on a particular day? Did you have a little store there, or would you all have to take a boat or a monitor over to Chincoteague to get all your groceries?
Mr. Bill Scott kept store on Assateague all of his life. Of course, he had to come to Chincoteague and get the supplies. He sculled what we call a big scow. My grandfather Jones, Uncle Bill Jones, Uncle Frank Jones, they all had horses and a cart. Now, the horses they had were a size bigger than a pony and a size smaller than a big horse. But those, we called them horses, they would pull a plow, they would work to a cart. None of them were, I'll say, rich enough to have 2 horses. So the horse had to double as a work horse and a riding horse. I never did learn to ride a horse. My dad could.
Is that
My dad was a good horseback rider. I always felt like I was too far up in the air.
Oh, you wanted to keep your feet down on the ground.
Yeah. Terra firma.
Okay. One of the other things I wanted to ask you was if we could move on to the smallpox on Assateague when that broke out. Could we talk about that a little bit?
I don't remember anything about that. My dad told me there's a place on Assateague that's called Smallpox Field. The people that died of smallpox, that's where they were buried. And one particular woman, when they buried her, well, they dug the grave and they poured what we call quick lime on her to eat her up. That's not a very pleasant thought, but that's what it did.
Do you have any idea the approximate location of that area where the smallpox field was?
I don't know exactly, but when you cross the bridge to Assateague, it's up farther that way.
Okay.
And they call it Smallpox Field.
Was the main cemetery the one that's located to the left of the foot of the bridge? Was that your main cemetery location there?
That was the main cemetery. Now, the only person that wasn't buried there was buried right to the south of where Mr. Bill Scott had his store on what we call a hill, and that was Mr. George Elliott. I've heard my daddy say that he has been to Mr. George Elliott, and if Mr. Elliott wanted some fish, he had the fish in a basin of water. He would scale them, and my dad used the expression, he took a rag. He took a rag and wiped that fish off and laid it in the frying pan. And he said he never smelled anybody's fish that smelled as good as Mr. George Elliott's.
You all had a church in the little village.
Yeah.
And that was probably a lot of your social activity was around the church, I would imagine, correct?
Well, most of the social activities were at the schoolhouse.
Okay.
I remember going to the church one time.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember what the procedures, not the procedures, but the traditions for the funerals were like living on Assateague?
There never was a funeral on Assateague that I know of.
So once a person had passed away, they were just pretty much buried within a few days and nothing special, no special church.
I've never heard my dad say, but I think maybe they would keep them up maybe for 1 or 2 days because they weren't embalmed, and after 3 days, a person starts to deteriorate.
Right. Leaving that topic and going back to just growing up on Assateague, I understand the problems of mosquitoes. What would you do?
We had mosquitoes like that. And when we would go down to Tom's Cove to go clamming, we would, what's the name of that bush? It's a bush that has real soft leaves, almost like velvet. And we would cut a little branch about swatting the mosquitoes off of her back, you know. But they were, and...
Is that a sumac plant? Sumac? Was that the name of the plant?
I think that was it. We would build sometime what we called a smother. It was a can equivalent to our 5-gallon cans. And we'd build a fire in it, and then we would go get some green branches and put on it. It wouldn't be a blaze, but it would just be a smoke, and that would keep the mosquitoes that like that.
Was there ever any type of plant or device that you could wear on your person to keep the mosquitoes off, since you didn't have sprays or anything
No,
like
we didn't
that?
have any sprays.
Right.
We just used that shoemake bush and swap them.
And I've also heard that sometimes you would keep those by the door, and you'd have to swap yourself before you went in the house to make sure that none of the mosquitoes or bugs got in. When the graves were, I know I'm jumping all around here, but it just dawned on me, did you have markers back then for the graves?
The markers then, when you go over on Aztec, almost as soon as you get off the bridge, on your left going over, there's the cemetery. A lot of the markers were either a cedar and another one that wouldn't rot. And they'd have sometimes be like a cross, you know, something like that. And some of the graves were outlined with, we'd call them seashells. They were really conch shells, you know, right on around the grave.
Okay, so anything else you want to say specifically that you remember about growing up before your high school years?
I didn't grow much.
Oh dear. Okay.
I know what you mean, yeah.
Okay. Well, Mr. Roy, when you started going to high school, was that something that you did every day or a couple of times a week, since you had to be transported?
Every day.
Every day.
Yeah.
And what time would you start in the morning? Was there one boat that came and picked everyone up?
Well, one of the lighthouse keepers was named Mr. Collins, and he had 3 daughters. And he had Mr. Collins had a boat, I guess it was 22 or 23 feet long, just an open boat. And it had a Kermit motor in it. And that thing would run, as the old saying goes, just like a clock. And one time, he couldn't get the boat to go, and he come and got my daddy. And my daddy says, "No wonder, you've got the needle valve turned about 7 times more than it should be. It was just flooding up. You know, when the engine floods up, she won't start." So he adjusted the needle valve, and the little engine perked pretty good.
And off to school you went.
Huh?
And off to school you went.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of your teachers' names?
When I went to Chincoteague, the first teacher that I can remember was named Miss Elsie Mears.
Really?
And the next one was Miss Elizabeth Butler. And Miss Elizabeth Butler wore a man's white shirt with her sleeves rolled up, and she wasn't a big woman this way. She was a big bone woman, you know.
I understand.
And listen, the boys didn't give her any back talk. No, indeedy. When she spoke to them, they did what she said.
She'd take them down a buttonhole or two if
She
not.
could if she wanted to, yeah. They didn't buck her.
Now, what time do you remember what time the boat would leave in the morning to take you to the school?
Mr. Collins couldn't take us until sunrise. Now, in the dead of the winter, the sun rises later. And he couldn't come out of the lighthouse until sunrise. He extinguished the light at sunrise. And then he'd come down to the landing and ferry us across. And when we got to the eastern side, the bus would pass us, but they couldn't pick us up because we didn't live on Chincoteague. So we walked from east side
On
to
Church
School Street, yeah.
And what time would you come home from school?
I think the school dismissed at 3:40. And we walked down to east side to where the little boat was. And he'd take us across the channel.
Now, did they have lunch provided for you, or would you have to pack a lunch to take there?
Most of the time, my mom would give me a dime and 2 pennies. Now, that sounds like a very small amount for a lunch. But a dime and 2 pennies will get you a big ham sandwich, and at that time you could get twist. I don't know whether you've ever heard twist or not. It was a pan about that square. The thing was, it was like it was twisted, you know. It was like a cinnamon bun, only instead of being round, it was this twist. You could get a big orange drink. I don't know whether you've heard tell of a big orange drink or not. But you could get a big orange drink and you could get a ham sandwich for a dime.
That wouldn't go very far today, would it?
And one day, and I'll never forget it, Ralph Watson had got a big sour pickle. The pickle would cost 3 cents and 2 cents worth of oyster crackers. Would be a little bag about that tall full of oyster crackers. And he took a bite of that pickle and squeezed it. It went whew, like that, and that vinegar went right in my eye. It's funny how little things like that will stick in your mind.
Do you remember any of your classmates' names?
I remember the 3 girls that sat in front of me was Genevieve Andrews, Eula Beebe, and Lily Colonna. They sat in front of me. Of course, there was Murray Sharpley, Ruby Lee Sharpley, Sarah Tarr, Helen Hill. Oh, I could think of a lot of them.
Now, even though I'm sure you were very well behaved, you also strike me as a prankster. Would that have been true? Did you do any pranks when you were in school, or play any pranks on your friends or teachers or anything?
Never did.
Never did.
No.
You were afraid that big teacher would come after you, weren't you?
Yeah, she wouldn't have to have a paddle. She could just grab you and shake you.
And when you were in school, did you form any particular relationships that were like very special to you, or anyone in particular, even growing up, that were mentors to you or really guided you along in your life?
No.
No. Just your mom and your dad were your biggest influence?
Most of my life, I have been, I guess I'd be qualified as a loner. But a lot of times being a loner keeps you out of trouble. Because if you're with a group and they do something, it's easier for you to go along with the crowd. So I was I guess I'd be classified as a loner.
Mr. Roy, were there any particular events that shaped your life?
No, not really.
Well, let's talk about when you moved to Chincoteague. What year was that? Do you remember?
I moved from Assateague to Chincoteague in 1933.
And the primary reason for moving from Assateague to Chincoteague was?
It was more to do on Chincoteague. During the carnival time, going to the carnival, I mean, that was a big thing. And when I was growing up, what little bit I did,
What little bit of growing up you did?
yeah, what little bit of growing up I did. If we could get to Pocomoke one time a year, I mean, to my generation at the time, getting to Pocomoke one time a year, that was a big thing. And if we got to Ocean City one time a year, that was the climax.
Okay. So when you moved from Assateague to Chincoteague, you had lights, electricity, which
Yeah.
you didn't have before on Assateague. So people were slowly starting to migrate to Chincoteague then, weren't they?
Yeah.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you, how did you feel about moving there after you had grown up on Assateague and what little growing up you did, and you finally moved to Chincoteague? Was that sad for you or just full of excitement because it was a new adventure?
Well, I had lived on Assateague and it was my home. And even today, I have a friend that comes about 3 times a week to get me, as we would say, get me straightened out. I know how to keep house. I know how to vacuum. I can do all that. But my niece by marriage, she wanted this lady to come and get me, as we would use a colloquial expression, get me squared away.
Right.
So I don't object, because she's we phrase it, niece by marriage.
Gotcha.
You know what I mean?
I do. I do.
And she always says, she calls me Uncle Roy. She says, Uncle Roy, if you ever need me, call me.
Right.
So, but so far I've not had to call her.
Well, good. Well, now, just one thing to make sure that I have this understanding. When you moved to Chincoteague, you had the electricity and you had lights, which were very nice, and you used fish oil, is that correct, for the lights that you did have on Assateague? Is that what you
mean the
used?
lighthouse?
Well, no, in your individual homes?
We had most of them had what we call a nickel lamp. I don't know whether you've ever heard tell of them or not.
Sure.
But the base was about like that, and then it come up like that, and then it sheared off like that, and it had a round wick about that big.
Wow.
And a globe, a glass globe. My mother, almost every night when it come time for to light the lamp, have a light, she would clean that globe, because the cleaner the globe was, the brighter the light was.
Now, when you moved to Chincoteague and you got out of high school, your career, would you like to tell us what you did for a living back then?
Well, I've either worked on the water or around the water all my life. I worked for the Bunning Oyster Company for 40 years. I came out of school because I wanted to go work on the water like my dad. I did what I wanted to do, but that probably wasn't the best decision.
Why do you say that?
Well, I could have turned to something else, but I don't know what that would have been.
And you've mentioned, I know in the past, not during this interview, but you loved it, even though it was hard work.
I like the water. I like to go clamming, I like to go oystering. I never did do any crabbing or fishing, you know, for a living. When we stayed to the old life-saving station, that was before the roadway was put across to the beach, you know. It was what we call an inlet. And on that side, which would be right off from the north parking lot on Aztec, is Old Tom's Cove. When you enter in on the beach, on your right going over is Fite's Cove. On the charts, they've got it Little Tom's Cove, but that's not right. And when you go over to Aztec and go over to the south parking lot, there's a little cove there, and that's Henry's Cove. Farther from that is a point that puts out in the cove, and that is Spring Point. So I know the names of, now I've not been down to where the old Coast Guard station was since Hurricane Sandy came through. I don't know whether everything has been covered over with sand, because the beach has been moved about 300 feet. I remember from Henry's Cove out to the ocean was a good walk. And now a man with a good arm can throw a baseball from Henry's Cove over in the ocean.
Do you remember much about living in the old life with the saving station on Assateague, what that was like back then? At the life-saving station on Assateague, did that have much of an impact on your life or the people of Chincoteague when the life-saving station was built down there?
No, it didn't have any impact on us, but it was nice to know that it was there.
Did you live in that life-saving station at one point?
The old life-saving station, yeah.
You did. When was that?
I guess that's been 70 years ago or more.
Now, there is one thing I wanted to cover too about during your career and when you worked on the water. There's a particular bread that you said you used to make all the time. Can you tell us about that and how you would make it?
A lot of people that lived on Chincoteague, and even the ones on Aztec, they would go down what we call down the bay. And the down the bay boat was something like that. We made down the bay bread. We would take a bag of flour, dump it in a keg, take a bottle of, we call it East Powers, put it in that keg and stir it all up. And then when you got ready to make bread, all you had to do is get your, and we use pure lard to mix it all up, and then we'd get a can of salt water and put in there, and that made it just salt enough. And we called it down the bay bread. And every now and then now, I'll make a piece of down the bay bread. I know how to do it.
It sounds good.
And the little boat stoves we had were about that wide, or that long, about that wide, about that deep. And they had 4 lids that you could lift the lids and put a pot or a pan on it, and you had more flame under it. And the little baking pans were about like that. And if it was my time to cook, if we had 4 men in crew, I would make 4 pans of bread, give each man a pan. And if you had good wood, that when I refer to good wood, some wood heats hotter than others. And I have put my bread in the oven and sit on the locker and watch it burn, watch it brown. And if the fire wasn't too hot, you kept the oven door closed. So a lot of people say, boy, going down the bay was a hard life. It might seem like it was almost like camping out. You know what I mean? But I liked it.
It sounds like
and you go out and work, and you were tired, and that night when you, I used the terminology, when I got in my bunk, it felt good.
Mr. Roy, do you want to talk about the flood at all? What that was like living on Chincoteague during the time of the 62 storm?
In the 62 storm, at that time I lived out on what we call shorefront, South Main Street. And just before sunset, I looked, well, people on Chincoteague, whenever the wind come to northeast, the tide automatically come up. And on a full moon, the tide would come up above normal. So this particular night, I saw the tide come across the road. I said, that's very unusual. And then it kept coming up and coming up. It didn't come in our house. We had 3 steps to our back door, and the tide came up to the 3rd step. And it was eerie looking. And a National Guardman come there and said, you folks got to leave. Well, my brother-in-law worked to the base, and the fellow that worked in the photo lab with him took my brother-in-law and his family, and his mother-in-law took me. And she was just as nice as can be, but I didn't feel very comfortable. And next morning, when my brother-in-law was going to work at the base, I said, Tommy, can I go to the base with you? He said, sure. So when I got there, there was a fellow that was coming to Chincoteague to help clean up the debris and stuff. So he brought me to Chincoteague. I went to the firehouse, and they served the people there, a good meal. And then I walked down home. But I had a bayside bathtub and a whole load of debris in the backyard, so I worked cleaning that up. But no life was lost or anything.
That's wonderful. Before we wrap everything up and close the interview, is there any other stories or memories you'd like to share with us?
Well, my life has just been an average life. And when in Chincoteague, it boasted of its lighthouse. That's the central figure. And then down at Tom's Cove, and that's where we go clamming. and there was 2 fish factories on Aztec. There was the life-saving station. There was the church and the school. And the only handicap was we had to cross channel in a boat. And I had a sheepskin coat. I don't well, they make sheepskin coats anymore or not, do they?
Oh, yeah. They do.
And I could turn that big collar up, and if it was rough and the spray would fly over the boat and freeze, I'd go down in the furnace room and let my coat get dry. I walked. I mean, I walked when I lived on Aztec, and when we got on the east side, we had to walk from there to the school. So I've walked all my life. Slender my legs have not been given out.
Would you say, Mr. Roy, to sum everything up, even though people were poor on Aztec, if, as you've mentioned, would you say that you had a very happy life there?
Yeah, well, we were poor in one sense of the word, but nobody ever went hungry on Aztec, and I've never gone to bed hungry in my life. And I read in a magazine where in this country there are millions of children go to bed hungry. And if I had a way to feed them all, I'd do it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Roy. This has been wonderful. Are you tired of talking?
No.
No?
I'm not tired. I'm not doing anything.
Okay.